Boa tarde. Eu tenho dois papéis neste fórum. Um primeiro é ser o mestre de cerimónias e relativamente a esse papel trago mais notícias, que estamos meia hora atrasados. E um segundo papel, que é mais agradável, que é o de vos divulgar em primeira, eu não diria em primeira mão, porque alguns de vós já têm acesso a estas conclusões, o qual foi discutido convosco, mas compete-me a mim divulgar algumas conclusões do estudo TMT Predictions. Algumas delas serão também divulgadas nos painéis de debate que realizámos em conjunto com a APDC, tendo como base o estudo internacional da Deloitte, que apresentamos todos os anos sobre o setor das telecomunicações, mídia e tecnologia, que é liderado aqui por este senhor, que é o Paul Lee. Algumas notas relativamente ao estudo, alguns pressupostos e algumas linhas de orientação e características da sua execução. Portanto, este estudo decorreu entre fevereiro e maio. Na sequência, este estudo decorreu entre fevereiro e maio, na sequência do estudo internacional Predictions da Deloitte, que foi publicado em janeiro. Teve como fontes de informação o estudo internacional, naturalmente. Teve contributos da direção da APDC, bastante válidos. Teve como base um survey que enviámos às 45 empresas que consultámos e que definimos em conjunto também com a APDC. Teve como base 25 reuniões presenciais que tivemos com os principais operadores. Na grande parte delas eu estive também presente. Teve também como fontes adicionais algum research da Deloitte. Teve como base 2 reuniões com o Steering Committee com representantes dos diversos operadores. Teve como base, obviamente, as nossas opiniões enquanto consultores independentes e teve também como base algumas entrevistas que efetuámos a alguns anunciantes, mais também para avaliar o contexto dos mídia. Uma nota relativamente a este estudo é que estas previsões visam contribuir para o debate, que vai decorrer de seguida, sobre os temas mais significativos do setor e não se pretende com o estudo Predictions, que não é essa a sua gênese, apresentar nem uma análise exaustiva do setor, nem repetir tendências que no contexto das TMTs venham já de anos anteriores. Pretende-se com este estudo, sim, dizer aquelas predictions ou aquelas perspectivas que são novas e que vão acontecer de forma diferente em 2009 e 2010 relativamente àquilo que ocorreu no ano anterior. No sentido de contextualizar essas predictions, nada melhor que fazermos uma breve apresentação do estudo a nível internacional que o Paul irá fazer e que eu gostava de vos apresentar o Paul Lee, que é responsável pelo grupo de research de TMT da Deloitte, tem desenvolvido este estudo há 8 anos, tem uma vasta experiência no setor, já publicou dezenas de publicações e de livros, etc. Escreve regularmente no Financial Times e o Paul vai-nos apresentar as predictions globais das TMT e eu depois farei a sua localização para Portugal. Paul.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much for the introduction and thank you once again for inviting me to speak at this event. It's always great to come to the Predictions launch in Lisbon. I hope you can hear me better now. It's always great to come to the Predictions launch in Lisbon. We have, as Miguel mentioned, a launch in quite a few cities. I think this year it will be about 40. And the Lisbon launch event is always one of the most impressive. And I've been to Portugal, I think, now 3 times in the last year. And it's always great for 3 reasons. There's always great conversations, so lots of new ideas. It's good to see old friends. And I also love your pastéis de nata, which are fantastic. Thank you also for your inputs into predictions for last year. And for next year, I've already spoken to Diogo, who's going to be providing some of his inputs for next year as well. So thank you very much. What I'd like to do in the next 15-20 minutes is just give you an overview of the predictions, some of the major results coming out and some of the individual predictions which I think are some of the most representative. So let me just go through to that. And first of all, because we have in total 30 predictions, what I wanted to do was talk about some of the major themes that we saw coming out this year across all 30 predictions. So the first theme which I'd like to talk about is what we call the benefit of the doubt bubble being burst. And what we would observe is that over the last 6 or 7 years in the TMT sector globally, as well as within Europe and within individual countries, there has been a mood of optimism similar to the mood that we saw prior to the dot-com bubble, or what was inflating the dot-com bubble. And we think that kind of mood has largely been replaced now by pessimism. So a lot of the business models which worked up to last year are no longer effective, and we'll talk more about that shortly. Secondly, one tendency that we've seen has been a move from green tech, which was certainly very popular last year and possibly the year before, to what we call lean tech. So we see there is still an interest in green technologies, but the primary focus is that any new technology going in is efficient, is lean. And if it's green as well, then that's a bonus. But it's no longer the primary focus of what companies are doing. Thirdly, from profligacy to parsimony. And what that means is that we've had an era over the last, of most of this decade, and possibly over the last 20 years, where there's been a gradual expansion in credit, in funding, both at the business level and also at the consumer level. And that's been replaced by quite a different attitude now. So as humans, I think we never act completely rationally, and so we always tend to exaggerate or overreact. And we've moved from a phase where we spent more money than we had to one where we're saving very vigorously. And in countries with a high savings, with a previously low savings ratio, like the US and the UK, where we almost save nothing, now we're saving very, very hard. And that's going to impact all of technology, media, and telecoms for better, but also for worse. A fourth theme is what we call green shoots, so signs of growth. And I think at the moment there are lots of people looking out for any signs of growth, given the bleak prognosis that we've had, and one of the prior speakers referred to that. And we do think there are plenty of good ideas out there. The challenge now is that quite a few of those good ideas won't necessarily make it to market, or they will take a lot longer to become successful because there is a lack of funding out there to make that happen. Another theme is innovation becomes an imperative rather than an experiment. And innovation is something which is always talked about at these conferences. And we often think of innovation as a driver for growth. But we would argue that now and over the next year, and possibly over 2011, innovation will become essential just to survive in the market, to remain viable, to remain alive. And one of the things that we don't know, but we can only speculate about at the moment, is what is the new normal going to be across all sectors? So if we accept that over the last few years we've had an unusual economy because we've had too much credit, because we've been exuberant in the financial sector, but that's also affected all other sectors. When things settle down, where will they settle down at? So if you look at the airline industry, if you look at the automotive industry, if you look at telecoms, media and technology, what will the new normal be? And that's one of the questions which may require innovation to address. So if you're in the media sector, and if you've been used to a certain level of advertising revenues, but if the new normal is 20% less, then how do you innovate to be able to deliver that? And the final theme is known unknowns and untrue truths. And for many years we've been used to several views of the market. One of them has been the view that, like, for example, bigger is better. And we've seen that across not just TMT, but across other sectors. And now we're questioning that. And another view has been, for example, things like Moore's Law, which is an observation on how quickly technology improves. And we would observe that, whilst Moore's Law may still be possible technically, it may no longer be possible. The commercial demand for what Moore's Law can deliver may no longer be there. So I'll just go through to the first prediction that we're looking at. And what we have here is just one of the predictions from the media predictions. And on the bottom left, is some of the other predictions which follow this theme. And this prediction is that the markets get antisocial with social networks. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with social networks, like Facebook and MySpace and LinkedIn and Twitter. And for a long time, there's been a big belief in social networks. And the reason is because they've grown very quickly. So the quantum for success has been the faster the growth and the bigger the underlying numbers, the better. So if you can gather 10 million subscribers or users in the space of a month, that is a good thing, regardless of the underlying cost. And what we're expecting is, in line with a lack of credit, that view becomes increasingly challenged over the year. And I think we've recently seen News International has talked about MySpace and cutting down some of the costs in MySpace, coming down some of the headcount. And it's an example of a corrected or a different view of what social networks are expected to be doing. Because always the underlying assumption was that the more users you would have, the more revenue you could generate. And most of that revenue would come from advertising. And the reality is, with the more social networks coming on board, the more users there are, the more advertising inventory there is. And if you look at one measure, which is cost per thousand, or CPMs, the CPMs for a lot of sites have been dropping very, very quickly. So if you have a commodity news site now, the CPMs are in the region of 10 cents. So for every 1,000 page impressions you get, your revenue is 10 cents. And when your CPMs are that low, it's very, very difficult to survive on advertising alone. So the fundamental business model of these companies can no longer work. And in terms of advertising, so one of the challenges is revenues, and another challenge is privacy. And there's a company called Form, which is P-H-O-R-M, which is actually a company founded from former KGB intellectual property, which is delivering targeted advertising based upon consumer behavior. Yesterday, BT announced that it would no longer offer Form as a means of generating revenues for an ISP. So it's one example of privacy leading to a contraction in service and a contraction in revenues. So whereas large customer bases were regarded as a benefit, we believe that they'll be regarded as a liability, and there'll be a lot more focus on working out what the cost per user is, particularly if that user is uploading lots of video. And one of the things about social networks is perhaps management teams have been very good at developing subscriber base, but have no experience or less experience of generating profits or generating revenues. And what is also possible over this year and next year is that some of the data that you have on some social networks or equivalent sites may go into liquidation, and some of the data that you have on there gets lost when the servers get turned off because they can't pay their bills. So the next prediction is what we called downsizing the digital attic. And the reason why we call it downsizing the digital attic is because, first of all, let me explain what an attic is. An attic is the storage you have on the top of a house. So this is one example of someone's attic. It's not mine. And basically, you use it to store lots of things which you don't necessarily need. And generally, the more storage you have, the more rubbish that you tend to accumulate. And that's almost a human trait. So I believe in Portugal, in particular for houses, it might be your cellar that you store stuff in, and it may be stuff that you don't use or look at for years, and it grows and grows and grows. And if you move house, you take your rubbish with you and put it into a bigger basement. And at a digital level, what we've observed and what needs to come under control is that proliferation, that growth of all that digital rubbish has become a sizable problem. And one reason is because of perception. So the perception is that digital memory is very, very cheap, which it is. So it's fallen 1,000-fold or so in price over the last 10 years. But the volume of data has grown, particularly driven by video. And there are still costs around looking after all that data, preparing it. And one of the costs which we mentioned there is all the servers around the world. The cost of just powering the servers is estimated at about $35 billion per year. So just for the power and the maintenance of that, the backing up, the securing of that is an additional cost. And one question that I would ask of all of you is, are your storage costs, if you know what they are, rising faster than your revenues? And in most companies that we've been talking to, it's certainly the case that storage costs are rising faster than revenues. But what that means is that some of the theories that we had believed in, like the long tail, which is the view that digitization would raise the value of all content, may no longer apply. And one study which has been done of music content available in the UK, where there are about 10 million tracks available, what it found was that 0.5%, so 0.5% of all the content generated 80% of all the revenues. And about 90% of all the content had never, ever been bought. And some of that content had been there for years. So that's one of the implications of thinking again about digital data. The opportunity for the software industry is deduplication software. One of the areas where we see potential is what we call the smart grid, which is basically applying intelligence to the distribution network for electricity. And the reason why that matters is twofold. Firstly, because there is more energy being consumed as electricity. And thirdly, because there is a lack of energy, which is what I believe you'll be talking about tomorrow. And thirdly, because a lot of that energy is inefficiently distributed. So of all the energy that is distributed, about 2/3 of it is lost on the way to its end usage. So what smart grid does is it provides some intelligence around there. So that intelligence may just be around trying to control usage at peak times. Now why does that matter? It's because the grid is built for peak usage. And if you can get the peak a bit lower, it may mean that you may not have to invest in a brand new power station. And a power station's cost is you're looking at €1 billion easily. So if you can remove that cost or control that cost, then that's very powerful indeed. It's being talked about a lot in the US, around Europe. So that's one of the trends that we see, not just for this year, but for several years to come. On the green IT issue, you may be aware that data centers are one of the most important functions within an IT environment, but also one of the fastest growing in terms of volume and also cost. We think that this year and in years to come, there'll be increased focus on trying to control data centers. And in terms of the scale of data centers, so when the first data centers were built or sort of created, they tended to be just rooms within offices. And now the largest data centers being planned will cost about €1 billion. Those are for shared locations. And in terms of their impact, in terms of energy, for the UK, you're looking at 3% of all energy consumed is for data centers. But there are massive savings available around data centers. And one of the biggest savings is just in terms of cooling the data centers. That is half of the cost of a data center in terms of operational expenditure. And one of the biggest ways which is being tried out now is basically to use an open window to cool down a data center. So to give an example, there is one data center being built in New York by Yahoo, and they're looking to have no cooling whatsoever and just rely on cold air and open windows to keep the data centers cool. So that kind of saving will save them 40% of their operational costs. So there's major savings there. Turning to media very quickly, one of the questions often asked when we have a downturn is which sectors are going to do better in a downturn than they were doing when things were going better. And our prediction for this year has been that the cinema will do well. And one reason why it will do well is because of the emergence of 3D technology. And you probably will have seen 3D films when you were younger, so things like Jaws or so. But what we're expecting is that for this year, or a prediction was $1 billion in revenues from 3D productions. And the current forecast is that we'll get to there for about August this year. And in total for this year, we might get to $2 billion at the box office. And it's something which, or 3D is something which the cinema requires for two reasons. First of all, it differentiates itself from the living room, where there are now very good TVs. And secondly, because it increases the number of people who attend and the price which they pay. So even though there are very few screens relatively which support 3D, they generate more revenue when released in 3D than just in 2D. And if you're familiar with Pixar or DreamWorks, all of their output now is going to be in 3D. And at the end of this year, Avatar, which is a Scott Cameron production, will be released, which is expected to generate $300 or $400 million in box office. And TV will probably follow shortly after. I'll just skip over this one to save a bit of time. Can I have the next slide, please? Can I have the next slide? Thanks. I'll talk very quickly about netbooks. Netbooks are basically small form factor PCs. And in 2007, the number of netbooks around was very small. 2008, there were probably about 8-9% of the market was netbooks. And in 2009, our current expectation is it will be 40% of the entire portable PC market. And one of the key factors of a netbook is what its price is. So at the end of last year, the cheapest netbooks that I could see in the UK were £175. And they were being sold not by a computer vendor, but by a toy vendor, by Toys R Us. And at the end of this year, the expectation is that there'll be netbooks on sale for £100, and again, not via a computer vendor, but in Marks & Spencer, which is a general clothing retailer. So what it does is it's making computing very, very accessible to everyone. And I think at that price, what it does is it makes computing available to a lot more people, but it enables scattered computing. So rather than having one computer per person, you may have one computer per room in your house and use that for a variety of applications for quick snatches of, say, email, messaging, finding out the weather, news, etc. And the big impact on the PC sector is revenues will fall as a result, because the average selling price is lower, the cost of the chips going into it is lower, the cost of the software going into it is far lower. But it could create a brand new sector in terms of computing. And you may see this approach, so low-powered computing being used across a variety of different devices. And I'd argue that the Nintendo Wii is an example of a lower-powered device being very successful, lower price, but doing what people want it to do. Right. Finally, just to talk about something in the telecom sector, disintermediation and the application store. You've probably heard of the application store, which has come out from Apple, also Research in Motion, Nokia, HTC, and others. And traditionally, telecoms operators have been paranoid or very concerned about anybody taking control of their customers. And what we'd argue is that this is actually a very good thing for the telecom sector, because what it offers, the application store, is finally the ability to convert mobile users from being voice users into being data users. And the average around Europe in terms of data users is about 20%. And we're in a market where revenues for voice and for data are generally falling. So we need some new kind of excuse to get people using data more. And we think that the application store is that. So if all the operators can generate 9 or 10 euros more per month from 10% of their subscribers, that would be quite positive for them. And finally, we're starting to look at predictions 2010, and we expect it will be challenging and interesting to do. And this is just one example of the complexity, I think, of trying to understand what's going to happen in the future. So you may have heard of Netflix, which is a US-based DVD rental company. And the reason why it's called Netflix was because the assumption was that within a few years, that most of its content would be delivered online. That was 2001. And 8 years later, it's still distributing to 10 million of its customers via the postal system. And the biggest competitor that Netflix sees right now isn't any online system, isn't Apple TV, isn't Hulu. It's actually this, a vending machine. So vending machines offering DVDs at $1 per rental are the biggest competitor to Netflix at the moment. And I expect in Portugal it might be quite a different scenario because you've got fibre to the home being rolled out. But it's one example of where to look to the future, you sometimes have to look to the past. So anyway, thank you very much again for your time, and I'll hand over back to Miguel.